words, I think I might start a fire. I'm losing all control, I'm giving in to desire. Climb over restless limbs, all tied up in knots from loving him. I'm going crazy, been going crazy. Being a jailbird, I'm burning down the walls to light up the front door, tearing down the halls to see the light once more. Jailbird, not gonna be a jailbird anymore. I don't feel any better now that I'm at my old dark cell. Maybe I'll be cold without my protective shell. But all I know is I won't grow, being captive to your control. I'm going crazy, been going crazy. Being a jailbird, I'm burning down the walls to light up the front door, tearing down the halls to see the light once more. Jailbird, I'm not gonna be a jailbird anymore.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Siwan and I'm the head of the Scaling Award at the Fair Education Alliance, and I will be supporting the session this afternoon alongside Ellie, who is our office manager. We also have our colleague Becca in the room, who's joined us this week to lead our youth engagement. So a huge welcome to you all to this session on researching the problem, the foundation of your initiative. We are really delighted to be joined today by Jenny Griffiths from Teach First, who's going to be leading the session. So we're really excited to have you at the Impact Festival, which is taking place until the 29th of April, with lots of exciting sessions still to come tomorrow and also next week. And we would love to see you tweeting about the event and the things that you're picking up and hearing from speakers, but also each other, using the hashtag Impact Festival and tagging @_the FEA. So before we kick off, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Fair Education Alliance and the two awards that we have open at the moment. So as most of you know, the Fair Education Alliance exists because we believe that no child's educational success is limited by their socio-economic background, a vision and mission that is shared by most of you on the call today. And we are a coalition of over 200 organisations across the business, the education and the charity sectors who collectively work to make education fair in England. Now, in addition to our collective action and policy work, we also run 3 award programmes to nurture and scale impactful solutions to end educational inequality, 2 of which are currently open for applications until the 18th of May. So really encourage you to consider applying. Both the awards give 15 grand in salary contribution and 1 year of support to anyone who has a great idea to make education fair. So FEA members can apply for the Entrepreneurship Award, which is to support innovation within an existing organisation, and all members of the public can apply for the Innovation Award, which is for early stage innovators to turn a great idea into a thriving initiative. So you'll be able to hear a lot more about both awards during the festival in these events that we have on screen at the moment, and you'll also get to hear from current portfolio of 10 award winners as they share their experiences as well. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. and we are going to get started with a bit of a speed networking activity to get you to kind of meet each other and give you an opportunity to connect, but also to get us started and in the mind frame of the session topic this afternoon. So once you're in your breakout, we would like you to do a quick introduction of yourself, of your organisation, and have a conversation about the following question. So what is the biggest problem facing education today? So Ellie's going to drop that into the chat box as well, so that you will have that with you in the groups, and you'll have around 5 minutes in your groups to chat and to discuss. If you have any issues at all in your room, any tech difficulties, or if you're on your own, there'll be an ask for help button. Please do hit that, and one of the team will come in and help you with whatever the issue is. Ellie, are we ready? Great. Okay, we hope you have some great conversations. We'll see you in a bit. Brilliant. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some great conversations to start us off there. So without further ado, I am going to pass over to Jenny, who is going to take the lead from now. So Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming. I'll just do a quick intro first, to set the context of my work. So I am Jenny. I have been working at Teach First for about 18 months, or just over 18 months now, which in retrospect was quite summer of 2019, so quite a good time to have left the classroom. So prior to working at Teach First, I was a teacher, head of department, working in London schools for 10 years. And before that, so I was a career changer going into teaching. Before that, I worked in a number of different jobs that included singing, teaching, a bit of professional singing, also working for some architects in research, and prior to that for business in the community, doing sort of project management around retail-led regeneration. And somewhere in the middle, I did an MSc in development studies, which has got me interested more into social research as well, which sort of all those things combined is what led me to my current role, which is the education research specialist. And so what I do now is sort of a combination of things. One is sort of ongoing research. Basically, it's my job to keep up to date as far as possible with changes in the education landscape. I am a sort of absolute generalist, which is quite a challenge in itself. I feel like I don't know enough about anything, whereas I know quite a little bit about lots of things. So around pedagogy, how approaches to teaching, but approaches to teacher training, about leadership. I touch on different subjects, where my area is history. I've also recently run a specific project looking at early years and primary teacher training. And so I sort of help to support the development of our teacher training and leadership programs around curriculum design, but also carry out specific projects, like I say, looking at early years. And mentoring has been another area I've been looking at recently. And I need to start a project, and as soon as I find time, looking at school preparations, basically how we form our partnerships with schools and what they need in order to be prepared to take trainees. And that's incorporated quite a lot of our work around diversity, and how we support trainee teachers with specific needs as well. So a lot of things going on in there. What I'm going to do today is just sort of take you through some of the principles that I try and follow when I'm doing research, whilst recognizing that education research on itself is quite messy. It's not perfect. It's not a science, although we like to try and approach it in some scientific ways, and try and share some examples from my own experience. But what I really like is to get some of your input as well, from both your experience of things you've done in the past or things you're working on now that might lead you to questions that we can discuss as a group as well. So I will share some slides. I know sometimes it gets a little bit deaf by PowerPoint, but it might make it a little bit clearer, and obviously we can share these later as well. If I get this right, I should be able to see you at the same time. So you started off with this slightly provocative question, I think, around what is the biggest problem facing education today in your groups. So I'm going to play a little bit of bingo with you and see if what I wrote down as my list are some of the things you came up with. So perhaps if we could use the chat for this, if everybody could just put their sort of quick one-word answer in the chat. We can do this like they do in school. This is online learning, school style. So you're going to write your answer in the chat, the biggest problem, but don't hit return until I do the countdown. So if you just write it in the chat now, and when I'll go 3, 2, 1 and tell you when to press enter, we'll see what we come up with, and if we've got similar ideas or not. Right, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so unsurprisingly for this event, inequality comes up quite a lot, mental health, lack of resources. Yeah, okay, right, so did I come up with the same answers? Well, I've got inequality there. Funding actually came up in the little group I was talking to before, although we might want to dig into that and think about it. Maybe it's about how we spend our money as much as anything else. Curriculum relevance, behaviour, teacher retention. Okay, I should have put mental health there. I'm actually working on a big project around whole child development and inclusion, but I was doing this late at night. So I think one of the key things to recognise is that the perceived problems in education can be very different from whatever perspective you're taking. Some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them are very complex, and they're not easily solvable. But I think, you know, one of the things to do is then break down what the real question is. I mean, I think what people say to me is, gosh, what a big question. And it is. And it's not a question you could research, I think. So the first thing we'll talk about is just about the problem. So I think most people here are either engaged in an innovation project or thinking about it or revisiting things. And sort of, as I said, what I'll do is go through the process I go through when I'm starting a new project and think about what the problem is. So obviously that's the first stage, but one of the key things is to define that problem really clearly in order to help you find the answers. So one of the models to use, and this is only one, there are lots of other models you can use, but I quite like this one. I think it's quite straightforward. When I'm looking at evidence, the first thing I'm going to do is ask. What is the question I'm asking? I need really good questions. As I said, a question like, what is the biggest problem in education? Is just too big. So I might have to break it down and think, okay, what am I looking at specifically? Am I looking at inequality? Even then, why is there inequality in education? Be a really big question. So I'm going to have to formulate it really, really carefully and link it to the exact problem that I'm trying to solve. I'm going to have to look at access for the evidence I need to help me answer that question. What do I have available to me? What's that's publicly available or that I might be able to access in other ways? That might be secondary literature. It might also be practitioner evidence. If I want to go and talk to students or I want to talk to teachers or other people working in education, do I have that evidence available to me? And it'll be a mixture probably of quantitative, so sort of number data that's available, or qualitative data, more of that sort of opinions and responses to things. Third thing I'm going to have to do is appraise it critically. And I think that's a really key skill, and it's one I've spent quite a lot of time trying to work on. I don't always get it right, but we have to look at that evidence quite carefully and really sort of interrogate it for its validity and how useful it is to our particular problem. Everyone probably recognises the phrase that, you know, lies and statistics. I mean, statistics can basically tell you anything you want them to tell you if you're not careful. And it's really important that we're thinking about how we interpret the evidence we've got, that we're critically evaluating it, thinking about who the people are that are writing it and what it can tell us. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. Applying it, I think it's really important, particularly within education, which is not a scientific, I mean, it's not a scientific area. You can't carry out neat experiments in education. You can get some really interesting things, but you know, one group of students is very different from another group of students. Each teacher is different, and how they do things, even if you want them to do something similar, they're going to end up doing it in different ways. So we actually use our professional judgment a lot, and I think that's fine, and that should be recognised, that we actually bring our experience, bring our own knowledge to that problem and use that to help us interpret it, the information we've got. And ultimately what we want to do is assess and evaluate. I'm a great fan of evaluation, though I mostly try and make my data and performance colleagues at work do the actual number crunching, because actually it's really important to understand whether what we're doing is working. As a teacher in a classroom, I might come up with all sorts of ideas that might help improve the behaviour in my classroom or improve the outcomes in particular tasks that I've set them. But unless I'm actually evaluating what I'm doing, I don't know whether it's working or not. So I really need to be able to build that into my whole approach and make sure I'm checking those outcomes. So thinking about what makes a good research question, I think there are two things we always remember. That it's got to be achievable. You've got to be able to be realistically able to give it an answer. And I think, sort of big open questions that are largely about opinion are never going to give you an achievable answer. You're not going to find the answer to that question, or at least it's going to be so contested that it won't tell you anything interesting. It's got to be clear in scope and purpose. Really focus that question on what you want to get out of it. There's also that sort of practical issue, whenever you're in setting out on a project, is how much time have I got? How much have I got in the way of resources in terms of money, but also time, other people? How easy is it going to be to get the information I need to carry it out? All those things are really important. They do affect the outcomes. So, if I want to do interviews with students, it's a huge demand on my time, but it gives me really beautiful, detailed information. But again, it's going to be a sample, it's going to be a small number, and I have to be really careful about how representative that is of wider student opinions and how generalisable it is to my outcomes, and make that part of my approach. So I thought this would be a good time. We'll go out into breakout groups just for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, very shortly, and just have a bit more of a detailed think about this idea of what makes a good research question. And I've put 5 examples up there of the sorts of questions that might come out in research, and I want you to sort of go into the group and think about those examples. Do you think they're good questions? And if you do, why? Or what makes them a good question, or what makes them a weaker question? But you could also use that time perhaps to talk about any questions that you've got, that sort of research questions you've come up with, and think about how you framed those and if they're the most effective questions you think that you could. And then we'll come back as a group, and perhaps if a few people would like to sort of share their thoughts when we come back together, that'd be really helpful. So if we could go into the breakout groups, that'd be great. Okay, so I think we're all heading back in. So open it up to people if they've got any sort of thoughts or comments that came out of their conversations around those questions that they'd like to share. I don't feel I'm going to pick on people sort of cold calls.
I'm quite happy to share my frustration.
Go for it.
So for me, the big question is, what can we do to make all of our schools great? And the things that everybody identified as key issues were things like inequality. I wrote down the fact that we're not inclusive. We say inclusive, but we're not inclusive. And all of the data shows we're not inclusive. People wrote down mental health and all of those sorts of things. And the questions that you gave us to think about were about assessment, and they cheat measurement. But actually, it does nothing to help the children. It doesn't address any of the things that we collectively said were key issues. We're not brave enough to do stuff around people, emotions, belonging, connection, success, what it looks like to be a sustainable adult one day. We don't know how to measure it, so we don't measure it. So we just always go back to traditional ways of measuring because it's cheap. It's cheap, yeah, but it's not doing anything. And we've been collecting that kind of data for what, 50, 60 years, and it's not moved us on. So we actually need to say, what is the important question? And let's be brave enough to get the answers.
Yeah, no, I think that's an absolutely fair point. I mean, the questions I put up are absolutely to really sort of challenge our thinking. And, you know, I think we've been asking the question about how do we reduce the attainment gap for, like you say, for decades. We haven't done it. So we obviously haven't answered that question. So, you know, either we're asking the wrong questions or we're going about things in the wrong way. I think there are sort of 2 points to make. One is about getting the right question, absolutely. And we talked a little bit about that in our group, about there's one element of that is your own area of interest. I sort of mentioned we have to work within our scope of what's possible to us as individuals or in the organisations we're working with. Though absolutely we want to, and Fair Education Alliance and Teachers all about how do we also as a community come together and perhaps shift the focus to a different set of questions. But also it's about breaking down those questions into manageable chunks. So absolutely questions around diversity. So, you know, we know the outcome we want. So I think some of you may be familiar with the idea of a theory of change. We use them quite a lot in organisations. What's our end point? What do we want to achieve? So Teach First, you know, our mission is a fair education for all. But I can't answer that question in one piece of research. Nobody's been able to answer it in tens of years. So I have to break it down into steps. What can I answer? How can I get to that point? What are the things I need to do to be able to do that? So that, you know, questions around the evidence is showing us that boys are not doing as well as girls. That's unfair. Why is it unfair? And that, for me, is a sort of research question which is manageable. We can look at that and we can come out with some really tangible results from doing that we can put into place and evaluate and see if they're working. I hope that's going to reduce the attainment gap in one way. You know, but one of the questions you raised rightly, Alison, is about what we're measuring and how we're measuring it. And I think there's some great work going on at the moment through the integrated partnership and various organisations looking, and Teach for All are looking at how do we measure things like well-being and mental health, well, not mental health per se, but sort of within schools. How do we look at those questions of diversity? What does it mean to belong to a school, and can we measure that? How do we measure it? And therefore, you know, can we use that as a way to explore research that looks at how do we change that measure? How do we improve it? How do we make people feel? How do we make a school more inclusive? And it's not straightforward. That's the beauty and the challenge of education. I think, you know, it's not easy to measure those things, but there are ways to do it, and we can look at doing that. Some of these questions I've been looking at. I've just done a project on mentoring quality, and part of it is about that process of why am I asking the question. So it comes from evaluation. It comes from the evidence around us. We see the problems. I'm working in an organisation. We do a lot of evaluation of our programmes and our training programmes, our leadership programmes. We look at schools, and we try to identify areas of weakness in our practice, things that we're not quite getting right or that we'd like to improve, and things like mentoring quality was one of them. We know that mentoring quality is really important for how well trainees do and how likely they are to stay in the profession of teaching. So we wanted to understand why is it variable, and what can we therefore do to change that and improve that and make those schools support those mentors in different ways. So it's really about sort of combining our grand passions and the things that drive us and are really, really important to us in a way that also is sort of possible to research, that's actually, you know, where we can achieve something and have a tangible outcome. I think it's important to sort of make that distinction between a sort of a research project and that we're talking about now, and a sort of campaign. And I think campaigning is really important, and policy change is massively important, but in a sense it's a separate but connected area. And often the evidence we can generate through the research is something that we can then use to help support campaigning and driving policy shifts where we think they need to occur. But without the evidence, it's harder to do that. Any other sort of thoughts around that before we sort of move on to the next sort of thought process? Anybody else want to share?
Our group just looked more specifically at the question type itself and how that might lead to, you know, an outcome. So we looked at the attainment gap between boys and girls question. Mm-hmm. We were talking around, if you remove the boys and girls context, effectively you're saying we've identified a subgroup of students that is underperforming versus a different subgroup of students, however we decide to define those subgroups. And that's something we need to try and equalise. And you can sort of, you can go down the route where you need to baseline that figure out and prove that there is actually a significant difference between the two subgroups that you're investigating. And then it's whether you go down the line to try and address that with intervention afterwards, to bring that subgroup back up or closer to the other group, or whether actually you're investigating it to say, well, actually, is the education provision in the first place right? Is the curriculum right? Is the assessment format correct for this subgroup? Maybe it's just not working as well for this group as it is for this group, and can we address that in advance, so therefore this problem goes away, as well as addressing it with intervention after the fact, which is what you tend to see more in schools. So you'll identify that maybe your year 10 boys aren't doing so well, and come year 11 you're doing intervention like crazy with them to bring them back up before the exams. So rather than taking that sort of constant treadmill approach, you're looking at the bigger picture and saying, are we teaching this group the right way? Is our teaching reaching this group as well as it's reaching this group? Do we need to make sure it's accessible for all groups?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Also, yeah, think about the preventative changes you can make. One of the things I love about research is we start with a question like this, because what we talked about, some of us talked about, is having to break down the question. We're going to end up with sub questions, and we start with hypothesis, in a good scientific approach, and like you say, usually based on something we already know, or we think we know. So we've looked at the data in our school, we see that the boys are not doing as well as the girls, or we look at the retention data of teachers, and we see that they're all huge numbers are leaving in the first 3 years, and we come up with a theory why we think this is. And it might be something about the teaching style or strategies, or it might be something to do with the recruitment processes. And so we start with the hypothesis, and then we do a bit of research around it, and that might confirm what we think, and then we can explore it further to try and look at the solutions to that problem, like you say. Sometimes, and it's sort of a wonderful moment for research geeks like me, is when your hypothesis itself is challenged, and what you think was the case actually turns out not to be. And sometimes that can be about the way we're measuring it, where actually it turns out the way we've measured it isn't accurate. Or so, for example, the mentoring project I've just done, one of the things that we were concerned about was that we were seeing high turnover of mentors. It looked like 80% of our mentors in schools had very little experience. It was sort of just 1 year's experience of mentoring. And so, well, why aren't they doing 2 or 3 years? We know continuity is great for supporting people. So we did some research around this. I did some interviews, and actually what I discovered talking to mentors was that we were collecting the wrong data, or rather we were collecting incomplete data, because we were talking about people who were mentoring for our program, and a lot of those were new to the program, so they were new to Teach First. They'd only been doing it for a year or so, but actually a lot of those teachers had 5, 10 years, even 20 years of mentoring experience on different programs, but we weren't capturing that piece of data. So we had a really incomplete picture, which totally changed then how I needed to go about my research in terms of, well, what further research I needed to do around recommendation for how I could change that picture, because obviously what somebody with experience of mentoring needed in terms of training and support is going to be very different from somebody who's doing it as a new thing. So it's about, like you say, breaking down those questions even further and really sort of getting to the point of what it is you want to find out and how you're going to go about doing that. So let me go back to just showing my screen again so you can see what I'm talking about. So the first point, when I started with that sort of 5-point model, there are other models available. But sort of the first thing you're doing is about looking for this evidence. Now, if you're working in a school, you've probably got quite detailed data on your school, on the student outcomes and teachers involved. If you're working outside of a school, then you certainly have access to publicly available statistics and data like that. There are other sources of data. So the Education Endowment Foundation have a toolkit around teaching strategies, where they've done a lot of work looking at the effect sizes. Evidence-based education resource library. I've just sort of put a list there of some of the places you might find things that are putting out regular reports around particular areas. The Education Data Lab. One of the things just to bear in mind, it doesn't always mean that those sources are entirely reliable. I mentioned a little bit before about, we collect data for particular purposes, and it can be a bit risky to then use that data for other purposes. It might not translate well. we also, if anybody picked up today, it's a piece of work by Professor Jerome around the PISA scores from 2018 and how they're put together. And our government use them quite a lot to dictate education policy. And one of the questions that's come up is actually, are certain groups underrepresented in those statistics? Have they actually, disproportionately focused on higher achieving pupils rather than the lower achieving pupils? And again, that's going to change what comes out and what conclusions you can draw from that data. There's always a question of being careful about what evidence we collect and where we get it from. But there is, in fact, it's probably one of the positives and negatives of the digital world is that we do have the internet in our hands and we can get access to things very easily and very quickly. I would encourage people to get as wide a range as possible. So diversity of evidence as much as anything else, to make sure we're getting different opinions, different ways of looking at things, drawing on a wide range. In terms of finding it, I mean, I always talk about following the breadcrumbs and how I go about doing my research. If I start with a literature review and find out what's been said about this topic already, is finding a core piece of research, something really that lots of people know about that's fairly standard, or a meta-analysis which is drawn together lots of different studies around that area, can give you a really good broad overview. And it's a good starting point because, of course, they will have references that they've used to draw on, other studies that have been done, other pieces of research, and you can follow those, read up those, and then follow their references. So it's sort of following the little trails along to get as wide a picture as you can. Some things you'll have to discard as not being as useful for your piece of research, but it can be quite a useful way to get started and sort of build up your hypothesis and see if the themes that you're identifying are themes that other people are also talking about. The next step, the sort of third step then, is about appraisal, is about critical evaluation of that evidence that you've collected. Think about the validity of what's telling you. Think about how useful it is for your particular research project. And there's I read a lot of research. Some of it is fantastic, some of it not so much, and some of it is directly relevant to the particular project I'm looking at the time. Other things tend to get copy and pasted links into a huge OneNote for me to go and read later about a different topic when I have time. But I start with this: is it accessible? Can I get hold of the source? There is a big problem if you're not in academia of accessing journals that are behind paywalls. It is a problem. There's not too many. There are a few ways around it. If you're lucky, you've got alumni access to some journals through your previous university or something like that. If you do a little bit of searching on the internet, you can often find things that are not behind paywalls, or contacting the authors directly can be a very good way as well. And then thinking about the source that the person who's written this, or the group of people that have written it, are they trustworthy? Are they a credible source? So actually doing a bit of due diligence, I suppose, about understanding where that person's coming from, what their background is. Are they writing about something that they know a lot about? It's a good starting point. I can think about sort of in the pandemic, suddenly everybody is an expert in infectious diseases, but actually I really want to hear from somebody who really is an expert in infectious diseases and not somebody who's an expert in oncology, for example. Greater oncology, but actually, are they the right person to talk about this? Do they have the background? Are they expert? But also, is research transparent and ethical? I think that's quite important, particularly in education. Has it been carried out in appropriate ways? The second bit is to look at the methodology and appropriate methodology. There's lots of different ways you can carry out social research. Some of it will be quantitative, looking at the data. Some of it will be qualitative, so they may have carried out interviews, they may have done focus groups, they may even need randomized control trials. And you need to look at that and think, have they gone about it the right way? Is it the right approach to answer that question? So statistical research is great in terms of giving you a wide sample. We can look at some numbers across sort of the whole country, but actually, if I want to know what students think about school, I probably want to actually talk about students. But likewise, if I've only talked to students in a secondary school in London, then that's not necessarily going to give me a representative view of what students think if they live in a primary school in the Northwest, for example. So I need to think about how those methods have been used. Are they giving me a valid answer, a sort of accurate picture of what they're talking about? and the reliability. Am I going to get the same answers again? And this is where a lot of the qualitative research is problematic, in a sense that if I ask my 5-year-old what her favourite food is, she might tell me broccoli one day, and the next day it might be sausages. And I think, you know, always bear that in mind with qualitative research. Is it reliable? If I ask the same question to another group of students, am I going to get similar answers? And in fact, good research will have done that. And what we then are likely to see are more patterns and more familiar things. I think, like the question I asked at the beginning about the main problem in education, I'm going to get different answers from people, and I might get different answers at different days just because of what's at the forefront of your mind at any given time, or what particular work you're working on. But if I ask enough people in enough places, I'm likely to see patterns emerging that I can rely on. That I'm going to see lots of people talking about the same things. And that's all the same thing about how generalizable is it. Can I draw conclusions from this, and how strong are the conclusions that I can draw? Again, will depend on your sample size, depend on the quality of the evidence you're using. And you just have to be a little bit careful that you can't go, well, all teachers think this if you've asked 5. It's a standard sort of marketing tool to say, you know, 9 out of 10 cats prefer this particular brand of cat food. Well, if they've only asked 10 cats, so that's not really telling me very much. Whereas if they've done a really big sample, it might be. And always questioning our bias. The bias of us reading it, the bias of the person who's carried out the study, the biases of the people involved. It doesn't invalidate the research necessarily, but it is something always to be aware of and conscious of, and just questioning at all times. So we have a lot of that sort of invisible biases that we just have to check. And then the sort of, one of the key things is about the usefulness, the conclusions of that research that you're looking at comes, does it actually answer your research question? Now, of course, the research might not be carried out for the same question that you're trying to answer, but you do need to think about how closely related it is to that. Is it robust? Are the claims that they're making backed up by the quality of the research that they've actually done? One of the sort of, I'm a bit loath to call it common sense elements, but I think it is really, that is what it's about. Is it supported by other research? I think, you know, it's one of those things that if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it might well be. So if something says something really different from everything else, could be really, really interesting, really fascinating, but we just have to just double check, why is it saying something so different? Is that because their research is very different? They've genuinely found something that stands out, or is it actually there's a problem somewhere in the methodology or in the sampling size that might have skewed their results? And also, I think in education, it's worth always checking against your own experience. Without sort of falling into the bias hole, I think it is also worth checking that, you know, what you're reading matches the context you've been working in, and does it match with what you'd understand? And again, just double checking where you think it doesn't. So because if it doesn't, then it's worth just sort of looking for corroborating evidence, I suppose. And also, there's always a question of what questions remain unanswered. And obviously, hopefully, in your research, you're trying to answer some of the questions that are not being researched by other people, or not being answered by other people, or sort of specifically related to your context. But it's always worth bringing out those questions, which might then lead you down another path in your research to help try and answer those, or it might just be something that you need to sort of address in your own research. I mentioned bias. It's just a neat little summary diagram, just a reminder that there are lots of different cognitive biases in the ways we think, and it's always worth just double checking in everything we do. We all fall victim to quite a lot of these at various points, and the key thing is just to keep checking. You know, we have to be careful of confirmation bias. Yes, does it match my experience? But let's not fall into the trap of assuming it has to match our experience and therefore it's right. Just because it matches my experience, actually that might be wrong. The groupthink, there's been some interesting things around professional development on this recently. Various people just trying to challenge you. Where we see consensus, that might be because the evidence genuinely leads us to consensus. It can also just be because we reinforce the things that other people have been saying. And there are lots of others that I'm sure you're familiar with, and I can share these slides later with a link that you can sort of explore them in a bit more detail if you need to. This is some more important people in education than me have done an awful lot more detailed research and are experts in the field. But things that they do point out, what I said, in practice, classrooms are complicated places. If you're doing research, particularly in classrooms, there's not necessarily one answer to that question. The questions we talked about at the beginning, how do we reduce the education attainment gap? How do we check gender differences? There may not be one answer to this question, and the answer may be very context specific to the particular teachers involved, to the particular students, and that's fine. You may start with a piece of research somebody else has done and find it doesn't suit your context, and that's also absolutely right. They're not off-the-shelf solutions. We do have a lot of evidence around particular strategies that are likely to improve outcomes, but they don't always work in every place. So that's something that we always keep evaluating. Is it working in our situation or is it not? And things change. I love this one from Rob Coe because he's done some amazing work. But just because we knew it 10 years ago, things might have changed for those who've been involved in teacher education. I trained as a teacher now more years ago than I like to think. But the content of the training I received looks quite different today. What's gone into initial teacher training, there's a new framework of content, and because lots of new evidence has come out, and it would be wrong to think that won't continually change over time as we learn more and more about cognitive science, more and more about social factors, and also different things that are important at different times, or have come to the forefront perhaps, so we sort of explore those things. I'll just stop briefly there because I've been talking for far too long, and just see if anybody's got any questions or comments about anything I've said so far, or want to share any sort of experiences they've had in terms of doing research already that would be helpful to share.
I put a question in the chat on, do you have any advice for taking into account the bias of what gets published and what doesn't, and sort of where those who might challenge established thought or be from a non-traditional academic background might struggle to get published? Yeah,
this is a really important area, and it's something I've been exploring. I don't have any immediate answers, I think, and I'm not sure people do yet. I think one of the things I've been looking at trying to do in terms of the evidence base that we use as an organisation, and that I help with our curriculum design is I'm trying to make sure that I'm exploring as wide an evidence base as possible, that I'm listening to different voices who may be outside of the mainstream of publication. So, but it's not easy and it's not necessarily straightforward. So part of it is about trying to find the people that are talking about them, amplify their voices, and really listening to what people are saying. And I think it's not straightforward, and you're right about that. We are very dominated by English language publications, and I know through some work I'm doing, this whole child development work, I'm part of a global learning community, and we do it. I'm sort of talking to people right across the world on a sort of monthly basis about what they're doing, but I'm very, very conscious that we're doing it in English, and some of the people involved in that are, they're fantastic at speaking English, but it's not their first language, and it's much harder to share academic papers and things like that when they are not in English, from my point of view, because my language skills are poor. So that it's not a straightforward one. I think it is a case of listening as much as you can and amplifying those voices that you can hear. And again, it's like that's following the breadcrumbs. Sometimes if you can find one voice, that will help you lead you to find other sources of information. And follow that. And I think there is a lot more going on in that area of trying to diversify the research base. But there's, like with all these things, there can also be a lag. We know there are problems of diversifying academia, and it takes longer for changes to percolate through to the publication world as well. But I think we just have to keep trying and keep listening and inviting people to speak and inviting people to share what they've learned. And then publishing that on as much as we can.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? Or Okay, I'll just continue a little bit then. So we've talked about the importance of the research question and thinking about your access to evidence and what you can use and how you need to think critically and in assessing the quality of that evidence. And of course, then what you're going to be doing is applying it. And this is really important when you're thinking about using your professional judgment when you're looking at your problem and the evidence you've collected, whether it's qualitative, quantitative. I'm conscious that everybody is at a different stage in their research literacy. So, you know, some of you will know this stuff, I'm sure. Some of you will be less confident with it, perhaps. I am very much a bit on the qualitative side. So I do a lot of qualitative research with interviews and focus groups. And, you know, qualitative research is fantastic at getting at reality, hearing, you know, first-hand opinions, really get detailed information. It's personal, it gives you feelings, it gives you meanings, it's got all those why questions, and it's rich, but it has its problems. You know, there is subjective interpretation. When I have to analyze that data, I have to be really careful to try and avoid my own biases creeping into that and how I'm interpreting it. It's unreliable. We talked about this, you know, what people say one day might be different from what they say the other, and that doesn't mean we dismiss it, but we just have to be a bit aware that those perceptions can shift with time. It's harder to measure. It's quite hard to quantify, which makes it more problematic if you want to generalize answers. Again, because we're going to have smaller sample sizes, even if we try to make our sample as representative of wider populations as we can, we're still going to be, you know, talking about relatively small numbers. Some people feel that it lacks credibility for those reasons. The quantitative data, you know, it's almost like it's the reverse picture, in the sense that the strengths of qualitative become the weaknesses of quantitative. So, you know, we can make big comparisons, we can look at trends, we can test hypotheses when we have these huge data sets, either across schools or nationally, but we don't get the depth. You know, I can ask hundreds of students to select their favourite menu choice for their school lunch, but actually I don't really find out what they really like and what they don't. Equally good, sort of similar problems with sort of any sort of multiple choice questions. If I've selected the options, then I've already restricted the answers I'm receiving from the participants in that research. It can be considered more reliable. That's sort of slightly dependent on what the data is and how it's collected. And whether we think we're going to get the same answers again. We look at things like standardized testing and GCSEs or SATs results. Is it actually reliable? Well, we do compare results from year to year as if it is reliable. Of course, the problem is there are different exams every year. So they're not quite the same, and it's not the same cohort of students. So it's not 100% reliable. So again, we're really talking about trends rather than sort of 100% reliable. Nothing is ever quite 100% reliable. We get that more objective side, but we lose that individual voice. So though we can quantify reasons for things, perhaps we don't really get the story of what that means for an individual. But it can be more representative. We can get bigger sample sizes, but we just have to be careful, as I said, about statistics. We do still have to be careful about the interpretation of those statistics and what we really claim from it. But it is easier to analyse in many respects. So lots of different sources of data. And one of the key things for me in the sort of research I do in education is about triangulating. I never use one source of data. I'm generally, the research projects I quite often start with quantitative data, because that's usually where we've highlighted an area to look at in more depth. So we do regular evaluation surveys of programme members to find out the areas that they feel more confident in, or they're, you know, more satisfied with in our delivery. And if we pick out something that looks weaker, we might take that as something to explore a bit further. And what I would then do is go back into that quantitative data, perhaps cut the data in different ways, look at different age groups, look at different sort of career data. So which group of teachers are more happy with this type of approach or less happy with it? Is it reflected in their years of experience, or is it reflected in their role in school, the type of school they're in? So I can get more sort of detail from that. But then I also want to look at the qualitative. Does that match my hypothesis that's come out of my quantitative data? So it's about sort of seeing whether they match up or not, and also putting that in the context of wider literature as well. So I will look at, you know, literature from other studies around the same sorts of problems. I can compare what I'm seeing internally with what I'd expect to see from sort of other sources of data. Again, it's that sort of checking in with, you know, are we different or are we similar, and looking at those sort of common threads. I've got a few things here. I'm happy to talk about this if people are interested, but don't necessarily have to go into detail here. Just think about sort of qualitative approaches. We do a lot of interviews, but we also do focus groups. Just thinking, you know, sort of interviews are great for in-depth understanding, but they take a lot of time and a lot of effort, so I can do fewer of them, whereas a focus group gives you sort of an opportunity to talk to a wider group of people at the same time, but with all the difficulties of those biases that can creep into any sort of research where you've got a group of people together, that you can get groupthink, you can get sort of people less likely to share personal insights perhaps, and those sorts of things. So what I do then, I stop sharing for a moment, and we can just take that as sort of a break point and see if anyone's got any questions or things that they'd like to raise.
Can I ask, just to get a bit of a gauge? I'm sure it's difficult and kind of varies from project to project, but generally, how many, in a sort of bit of market research project when you're first at the kind of conception stage of an idea, how many questions usually are put forward and analysed, and what's the kind of mix of qualitative and quantitative?
By questions, you mean in terms of research questions?
Yeah, exactly, that put forward to the research group.
Okay, so I mean, if I use it as an example of a project that I'd be running, and so this is very much a sort of me as team leader, I will have a project team, but that's usually just people from other departments who I use as a sort of sense check, and because it's intended to support their work, so they'll give me feedback. But if I'm leading the project and doing most of the work myself, it goes back to our sort of original question, keeping it within scope and achievable. I'll start with my main question. I usually have 2 or 3 sub-questions. So for example, things like the mentoring, you know, I'll have one main question is about the sort of the quality of mentoring, but I might have 2 sub-questions about the level of experience of mentors, and then it's sort of linked to what my specific outcome was about the training. So what do they think about the training? So what are the areas of training that need to be different? So I'm sort of combining 2 sort of elements there. So I have a set of hypotheses that I then use as my starting point. And I think the important thing is what I will then do is usually at a literature review to see what the issues are within that area more widely. So what people are talking about with mentoring. We've got internal evaluation data, so I'll look at that as well, probably quite briefly at first. And that's usually then a good point at which to sort of revisit my questions. Am I asking the right questions? Am I likely to get the outcomes that are going to help me improve the training programs that we offer? And that's when it's always really helpful to get feedback from other people who are sort of perhaps delivering on the ground and get their sense as well. So we do a little bit of a sense check exercise, and then I'll go out and do a bit more. When I'm doing interviews, I will always draw out my interview questions and then do 1 or 2 to start with, and again use that as a way of checking my questions. Am I asking the right questions? Am I getting the sort of responses that are going to be useful? Sometimes you just discover that you're missing something really important that somebody offers you, or the questions aren't probing enough, or whatever. So I might then revisit my questions before going out to do another set of interviews. It can be really helpful to do joint interviews, to have somebody again sort of just sense check your approach to interviews, particularly if you're not familiar with interviewing, about avoiding all those issues of sort of leading questions, but making sure you get the rapport. If you've got somebody to help you do interviews, again, if you've got more than one person running focus groups or interviews, it's really helpful to do a few joint together, so then you can do them separately, but make sure knowing that you're taking the same approach, that you're trying, again, using the same structure of questions, so that you're not introducing a sort of a bias into the interview process. Did that answer the question? Yeah? Great. Any other questions or thoughts or things people have experienced.
If no one else has a question, well, we've got you. Have you had much experience with participatory action research? And does your process when you're working or researching alongside your, I guess, the people that you're researching, does that change your process at the beginning?
I think probably the simple answer is no, I haven't, but there are various things going on in organisation at various points where other people are exploring things like that. And I mean, we've done a bit of work around observation and sort of video observations and simulations, which I think are more like that, as more of a sort of working with the people involved to sort of understand how videoing your lesson sort of is supporting them, and how they perceive that as part of the sort of piloting approach. But it's not something we've explored at a great amount of detail. And I think it's one of those things, it's like all sorts of action research there will always be things that happen that do change your approach in the middle, without, possibly even when you don't want it to, but it will. It's like in the middle of any interview, we tend to try to use semi-structured interviews, simply so that we make sure we are covering the same topics and we're getting that information from participants that we can then compare a bit. So if you're asking about your motivation to do something, we want to ask everybody that question so that we can actually compare their answers. But of course, what happens in the central conversation is people will offer pieces of information that you weren't expecting, but if you suddenly realize that's a great piece of information, actually I might add that question to the next set of interviews. So in my feedback I then have to be clear that, well, I actually managed to ask that question to only half of my participants and not the other half. So my conclusions might have to be quite carefully framed, but it's not worth losing that sort of that really interesting information.
Great, thank you.
If there aren't any specific questions, I think probably what we'll do now, given the time, is if I give you sort of 10 minutes in groups, I think it might be quite a good time to talk through perhaps some of the research you've experienced or done, or your approaches. You can share with each other, and then come back to me with any specific questions that I might be able to answer. So my youngest one has just come to visit. The perils of working from home. So yeah, I mean, yeah, so should we go into breakout rooms for sort of 10 minutes perhaps, and you can have a bit of a chat and come back with any questions or anything that you think that I've missed. I mean, it's very much just trying to share the approach that I've taken. I don't claim it's the only approach or necessarily even the best one. There are lots of other things going on. I've signed up to a great webinar on creative research techniques, which I think is really exciting, sort of looking at non-traditional. We tend to sort of do quite a lot of traditional research, I think.
Could you give us an example of some non-traditional creative research techniques?
No, because I haven't been to the webinar yet.
Oh.
No, but I think it's things like participatory things, and there's a lot more work about sort of partnership between the researcher and the participant. So trying to get away from that, I'm the researcher trying to get data from you, and actually much more of a sort of partnership approach where you're learning from each other, which is a much more inclusive sort of way of doing things, and there's quite a lot of work going on around that. Yeah, and lots more sort of participatory action stuff going on. So, but it's something I'm really excited about finding more about. Okay, so I think we've got the people coming back that are coming back, but we've lost a few to double booking. I think this is a digital thing. I was just laughing earlier that, you know, at least when you're in a location, it's harder to walk out. There's a positive and a negative of being digital. It's sort of easy just to turn your camera off and just leave. But I hope you found that sort of a useful experience. The things I've shared, I was just trying to sort of share some of my experience of going about research, and, you know, there are other ways to do it, and there may be better or worse ways, and obviously it will depend very much on the particular project or the particular problem that you're investigating. But I also hope you found it useful to talk to each other a little bit and share that. So I think we've got about sort of 5 or 6 minutes now. If anybody's got any sort of anything they want to share that they talked about in their groups, or any questions for me that I might be able to help with, or sort of direct to other places. And just sort of a reflection on the experience.
I was just curious to understand what people's context was in coming into the session and what they were looking to get out of it. So I was just in a group with Françoise and Becca there, just talking broadly about that. And I just mentioned that from our perspective, I work for an educational charity delivering oracy skills workshops to young people in secondary schools, and how we go about measuring our impact. That's not something we did prior to me starting, and it was one of the things I wanted to get there. And I was saying the difficulty I found, I've come from a science teaching and previously science background, so very quantitative way of thinking, and then I come into a charity working, you know, with what you'd loosely call still soft skills and a very qualitative way of measuring. And I needed some numbers to work with because I was feeling a bit uncomfortable not having those. So I was trying to get somewhere. And then I think where the conversation went was, you know, in this sort of arena, you're relying on effectively semi-quantitative questions at best, or just full-on qualitative style questions, and then interpreting that very quickly into numbers and working with it quantitatively. And if those questions and those initial qualitative questions aren't good enough, or the number work and the quantitative work you're pulling out of it might not be reliable.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I find quite challenging, is that, yeah, as you say, trying to quantify things that are not really quantifiable in order to give you a nice measure that you can talk about impact, when actually what you're talking about is quantitative impact, and a lot of it being self-report. So you then get the same sort of problems as, well, you know, if a teacher says, yes, the oral skills have really improved, can we quantify that? How can we compare that to another teacher who's saying, yes, they've improved a little bit, or a lot, or massively, or not at all? Or, you know, how are we measuring that, and how do we compare? So it is a perennial problem of those sorts of surveys. But, you know, so I hope, you know, you've seen that there are some ways to go around it and triangulate different things, and perhaps sort of build in some of that qualitative talk.
We find a few quirks in our sort of data and questions as well that crop up all the time. So the classic one that I find that I haven't got a workaround for yet is, in one of our workshops, we ask students to rate themselves on their oracy skills, so the individual skills that we teach them throughout the day. You ask them to rate themselves from 0 to 10 at the start of the day and 0 to 10 at the end of the day. And obviously what we're hoping is we'll see that number improve. But actually what we're finding, sometimes we see it go down. And the only reason I can put it down to is, at the start of the day, the children don't know what they don't know. So they think, oh, well, I'm really good at talking, I'll give myself an 8, 9 or a 10. And then what they learn throughout the day, even though they've made progress and they've learned more and new skills, they've understood that they didn't know all that at the start. So they give themselves a slightly lower number, and it reflects in negative progress. And I'm always scratching my head at that, on how to better do it. So we tried to articulate a few examples at the start of the day that we would illustrate to students what the breadth of those skills might entail, you know, such as eye contact, body language, all these specific examples. So they might go, oh, okay, well, I wasn't aware of all of those, maybe I'm only a, and then we think, well, are we colouring the questions? And yeah.
It's a standard Dunning-Kruger model, that one. Yeah, you're really confident when you don't know very much, and the minute you know more, it plummets because you realise that you don't know stuff, and then it does increase again. So, I mean, one answer is to take more of a longitudinal approach and think about how that baseline and the longer term, because like you say, I mean, progress and learning doesn't happen in a day, and it's, you know, I suppose for that particular area, so the question is, do they then continue to use those skills that they've learned about and develop them on a long-term basis? So it's, you know, the practical challenge, but, you know, can you go back to that school in a term and get that, you know, repeat that question and actually see, you know, has it embedded over the longer term with quick questions? That's one way to look at it. The other thing is to do is, you know, as you repeat the process with different groups of students, although you've got the problem with different groups, you can then start to look at patterns. So as you say, if you're seeing the same pattern, you know why. It's not actually an indication that they're getting worse at it. There's a particular reason for that.
Just have interest, what was the effect you said that was called, sorry?
Dunning-Kruger.
I'm going to have to ask you to spell that, go on.
I'll put it in the chat for you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Can I ask, is that, sorry. Can I just, I'm just curious, listening to the question that was just asked, whether that may not have anything to do with the programme or with the pupils, but the way in which feedback has been given to them through the day. So if there's been a lot of red pen marking going on, and that does incredible things to self-esteem. And so you might start the day believing that you are a successful learner, you can do great things. And then the way in which feedback has been given to you just leaves you to feel demoralised. It's a bit like the way in which performance management is done. You know, it can either be performance enhancement or it could be you're not good enough. And that will really affect the quality of the answer that you get at the end.
I think that's something I've seen take place in a classroom environment as a teacher. Just thinking specifically about our workshops, I don't think that will be the case because of the way the learning takes place. Effectively, you know, we introduce a range of 21 different oracy skills, individual skills that students can demonstrate, and we do some sort of active group work to get them to understand what they are, model them. And I think it's that, I always feel it's that discovery of that broad range of skills, individual skills that sort of makes them think, oh wow, actually I didn't know any of this before I started. I didn't know that this range of skills was in this topic. I kind of feel like it's that effect that results in what can sometimes be a negative.
I think, yeah, Alison, I think you make a good point there, because I think one of the things we know is that, you know, your mentality or the psychological thing can affect your rate, how you rate things. So, you know, if you get on really well with a teacher, if you like the subject already, then you tend to rate things very differently, which is why actually self-report is not always a very good way to judge certain things, because we like to rate things, you know, we rate teacher quality higher in subjects we like. That's what the evidence shows clearly, and so it's not a good judge of teacher quality, in other words. So it's quite an interesting area to explore when you're doing a one-day type of thing. In fact, we all do evaluations at the end of sessions, as you'll be asked to in a moment. But of course, the real impact is, you know, do you take what you've learned from it and use it later on? Do you develop that further? So I'm conscious of time. So
yeah, we are at time, unfortunately. If there are any other questions, or if you want to share some contact details, I think there are a lot of organisations. So Richard, that question that you've asked is something that I've heard asked a lot of times before, and I know that it's something that a lot of different organisations have tried to and are still trying to grapple with. So please do kind of feel free to connect with other people who are sharing similar contexts. I know there was a lot of us smiling and nodding when you were chatting there, probably because we're in similar situations or have been in the past. So really encourage you to make those connections with people with similar roles, and let us know if we can help to connect you to people to share some of their tactics and strategies as well. I am going to wrap us up there. Please do, as I said, share your contact details if you want to keep connected. We have the attendee list as well with details there for people. But I'm going to share a poll. Ellie, can you activate the poll, please? And we would love your feedback on the session. It's the first time that we are kind of really running this as a 2-week event, so any feedback is very welcome. If you've got feedback beyond this poll, please do email it to us. And just whilst you're doing that, wanted to highlight a couple of sessions that are coming up. If you're interested in evaluation and impact reporting and measurement, we have a session tomorrow which is run by the Education Endowment Foundation, and that is looking at measuring impact and evidence as you scale. So what does impact measurement look like when you are at startup phase versus kind of growth stage versus kind of a really at scale, and what different development stages that can be. And also tomorrow for early stage entrepreneurs, we have a session on acing your grant applications as well, and plenty more sessions across next week as well. So do have a look at the timetable. So I have just a couple more people to vote. So whilst we're waiting for them to come through, just a huge thank you to Jenny for taking us through that whistle-stop tour of researching the problem. It can be a really tough place to know where to start and when to move from one stage to another, from kind of paper research and primary research to secondary. But we hope you feel more confident about the tools and the tactics to do so after the session. One person left to vote. Nearly in. Let me just check. Okay, great. Then we will leave it at there, and if we can, just as a finisher, come off mute and give Jenny a huge round of applause to thank her for the session today. Thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.